doors of Grand Valley Institution for Women slid open on a Tuesday morning in October, and I walked out carrying a garbage bag with everything I owned: 2 changes of clothes, a Bible with a cracked spine, and a folder of papers the parole officer handed me without making eye contact. 63 years old. That's what I was. I'd gone in at 55, and somewhere between those 2 numbers, my hair had gone fully white and my knees had started aching in the cold. The world outside looked the same, but felt completely wrong. The way a word looks strange if you stare at it too long. I had $8,400 in my account, money I'd earned doing laundry and kitchen prep in there, plus what remained of my pension deposits that kept coming in automatically even while I was locked up. Not a fortune, but enough to breathe for a few months if I was careful. They gave me a bus pass, a sheet listing shelters and halfway houses in Kitchener, and a handshake from a guard who'd always been kind to me. That was it. I didn't go to a shelter. I couldn't. After 8 years in a place where you never had a moment to yourself, the idea of another shared dormitory made my chest tighten. I booked the cheapest motel room I could find near the bus terminal, $47 a night, and I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time just listening to the sound of traffic outside. Real traffic, people going places. The first thing I'd promised myself. The one thing that had kept me walking the perimeter of that yard for 8 winters was that I would go to his grave. My husband, Lorne. He died of a heart attack 14 months after my conviction. Our daughter told me in a letter I wasn't allowed to attend the funeral. I wasn't allowed to do anything except read those 4 lines she'd written, so carefully distant, and understand that the last person who'd believed in me was gone. I took 2 go buses to get to the cemetery in the town where we'd lived, where we'd raised our daughter, where I'd thought I would grow old. Sunridge Memorial was just past the edge of town, off a county road lined with maples that had already turned. It was a cold, gray afternoon, the kind that feels permanent in Ontario in October. I stopped at a flower stand near the highway and bought 6 white chrysanthemums. I remembered Lorne always said chrysanthemums smelled like funerals, and he hated them, but they were the only ones that looked alive in the bucket. The groundskeeper's shed was near the entrance. An older man waved me through without much interest. I found Lorne's grave in the newer section. Flat granite, the kind the cemetery sold on a payment plan. I'd never seen it before. Lorne Gerald Ashworth, beloved husband and father. 1944-2017. I knelt down and started pulling the crabgrass that had grown along the edges. My hands knew what to do, even when my mind went blank. I don't know how long I was there. Long enough for the sky to get darker and for my knees to ache beyond ignoring. That's when I noticed the boy. He was maybe 7 or 8, small for his age, with red rubber boots and a rain jacket that was a size too big. He was standing behind the grave 2 rows over, just watching me. Not frightened, exactly. More like cautious, the way a bird is cautious, ready to go, but willing to stay. I smiled at him. "Hello there, you lost?" He shook his head. "I live here. My dad's the groundskeeper." I glanced toward the shed in the distance. "What's your name?" "Theo," he said, and took 1 step closer. "What's yours?" "Evelyn." I gestured at the stone in front of me. This was my husband. He looked at the stone with the serious expression that some children have around death, the expression that adults spend their whole lives trying to learn. "Did you love him?" "Very much." He was quiet for a moment, then walked closer and crouched down to look at the grave marker the way a person reads a sign. "He died in 2017. That's the same year my mom died." I felt something shift in my chest. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. It's okay." He said it the way children do when they've said it so many times it doesn't mean much anymore. Dad says she's still watching. He had an earnestness to him, this boy. The kind that hasn't been worn down yet. I reached into my coat pocket and found the roll of butterscotch candies I'd been keeping since the bus ride, a small luxury I'd given myself, the first candy I'd bought in 8 years. I offered him one. He took it, unwrapped it with the focused concentration of a child, and then looked up at me with those gray eyes that seemed older than the rest of him. "You're the one who came from prison," he said. It wasn't a question. I kept very still. "What makes you say that?" "I heard Dad on the phone last night. He was talking to someone about the woman coming to visit the grave. He said she was just released." He paused. I wasn't supposed to hear. "It's all right." I looked at him carefully. "What else did you hear?" He hesitated, twisted the candy wrapper in his fingers. Then, "Can I tell you something?" "Dad doesn't know I know. You can tell me." Theo looked back toward the shed, then at me. He lowered his voice the way children do when they've decided to trust someone all at once. "Last year, Dad came home really upset. He'd been talking to some men who came in a truck at night. He told my auntie on the phone I was supposed to be sleeping. He said the men opened a grave. This grave." He pointed at Lorne's stone. "They paid him money to stay inside and not look. But he watched from the window anyway. He said they took something out of a box. My hands had gone cold. I was barely breathing. Are you sure he meant this grave?" Theo nodded firmly. "I know because he said the name. Ashworth. I remember because it sounds like ash. And I asked Dad about it later, and he said I imagined it and changed the subject and made me hot chocolate." He wrinkled his nose slightly. "He always makes hot chocolate when he doesn't want to answer questions." I sat back on my heels and looked at Lorne's grave. 8 years. Someone had come in the dark and opened my husband's grave. They had taken something, and a child in rubber boots was the only one willing to tell me. I asked Theo if I could speak to his father, and he ran ahead to find him, looking back twice to make sure I was following. The groundskeeper's name was Russell. 40-something, quiet, with the kind of face that gives nothing away easily. He was polite but watchful when I introduced myself. I told him I was looking for any work, helping with upkeep, watering, tidying abandoned plots. I said I was new to town, newly available. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said he'd give me a trial week, cash, starting Thursday. I walked back to the bus stop in the failing light, and for the first time since I'd read the jury's verdict, I had something that felt like direction. What had they taken from Lorne's grave? That question followed me through the night. Lorne had been an estate lawyer. Quiet, careful, meticulous, 30 years of practice. In the last 2 years of our marriage, before everything fell apart, he'd become withdrawn in a way I couldn't explain. He stopped talking about his cases. He'd started coming home late. He'd grown anxious about things he wouldn't name. We'd argued. Not violently, never that. But there was a distance between us that felt like water rising slowly in a room. The night he died. The night they said I killed him. I remember his voice raised. And then I remember a sharp pain and darkness. I woke to sirens. Lorne was on the floor of his home office. There was blood. A glass paperweight lay nearby. The police detective, a man named Faulkner, looked at my hands, at the blood on my housecoat, at the neighbor who'd called 911 after hearing shouting, and had decided within 12 hours that the answer was me. My lawyer was 28 years old and had never tried a murder case. The jury took 4 hours. I spent 8 years in Grand Valley telling myself there was something I was missing, that the truth was a shape I hadn't found the right angle to see yet. 3 days into my work at Sunridge Memorial, I managed to get Russell talking during our lunch break. He was opening up slowly, the way people do when they realize you're not going anywhere. I asked him carefully about unusual things that happened at the cemetery, strange visitors, late-night disturbances. He went quiet. I pressed gently. I told him I'd heard rumors about things that happened in cemeteries, that I'd known someone whose family plot had been disturbed. I kept my voice light. Finally, he set down his thermos. Something happened here once. About a year ago, 2 men came in the late evening after closing. They were professional about it. Had a letter they said was from the estate, permission to access the plot for a document retrieval. But the letter didn't look right to me. Still, they paid. He stopped. And they went to one of the plots in the east section. Were there about 45 minutes. Filled everything back in, put the flowers back exactly right. You'd never have known. He looked at me steadily. Why do you ask? I told him it was my husband's grave. The color shifted slightly in his face. I didn't know you were. I was convicted of manslaughter. I wasn't. But I need to know what was taken from that grave. And I think you're the only person who can help me. He was silent a long time. Then he said, I wrote down the license plate. The plate was registered to a numbered company in Mississauga. That was as far as I could get on my own. But at the Guelph Public Library, I spent 3 hours going through the digital archives of the Waterloo Region Record and the Globe and Mail. What I found stopped my breath. Lorne had been the estate lawyer for a man named Gerald Paskey, a property developer who died 11 months before Lorne was killed. Paskey's estate had been contested. His business partner, a man named Dennis Wyard, claimed Paskey had promised him a share of 3 commercial properties worth roughly $14 million before his death. The dispute had gone to the Ontario courts. Lorne was the solicitor of record for Paskey's family. The case had been settled just 6 weeks before Lorne died, in favor of the family. Dennis Wyard had lost everything he'd counted on. I printed every article I could find and sat with them in the dim library light, arranging them like puzzle pieces on the table. Wyard had been furious, publicly so. There were quotes from him in the record. The documents Ashworth relied on were incomplete. Key materials were never produced. This will not stand. What documents? What had Lorne been holding? I went to see Lorne's former secretary. She'd worked for him for 19 years. Her name was Frances, and she met me at her kitchen table in Cambridge with the careful warmth of someone who has rehearsed being neutral. She told me she'd been contacted after Lorne's death by a man from the Provincial Law Society asking about case files. She thought nothing of it. Files were routinely archived. I asked her if she remembered anything unusual about the Paskey estate matter. She folded her hands. Lorne kept certain documents at home, she said finally. Files he didn't want at the office. I asked him about it once. He said they were originals he needed to keep safe. She paused. There was one folder he mentioned specifically. He called it the Paskey envelope. He said if anything ever happened to him, I should contact his daughter. Did you? I tried. After the conviction, I wrote to her. She never responded. And then she stopped. And then what, Frances? 2 men came to the office about 3 weeks after Lorne's funeral. Said they were from the estate. Asked if we had any original documents from the Paskey matter. I said everything had been submitted to the court. She looked at me. But I didn't mention what Lorne had kept at home. The Paskey envelope. Lorne had kept original documents at the house. The house had been sold after my arrest. But if he hadn't kept them there, if he'd hidden them elsewhere, in the grave. I know how that sounds. I know, but Lorne was meticulous and he was frightened and he didn't trust easily. And a waterproof document box sealed inside a casket is about as secure as anything can be, until someone with a backhoe and a forged letter decides to find it. I needed to know what those documents said. And I was beginning to understand that whoever had wanted them badly enough to open a grave was the same person who had ensured I would never be in a position to look for them. Dennis Wyard's name appeared twice more in the archives, once in a financial fraud investigation in 2019 that had been stayed by the Crown, And once, in a social column from 2016, a charity gala photo, Wired in a tuxedo, smiling beside a man identified as Howard Carling, the managing partner of a Bay Street litigation firm. Carling's firm had represented the opposition in the Pasquet estate case. I sat very still in that library chair and let that settle into place. I went back to Russell the next day. He'd had time to think, and he'd made a decision. I could see it in the way he met my eyes at the gate. He said the letter the men had produced for the grave access had a firm name on it. He kept a photo on his phone because something had felt wrong to him at the time, and he'd learned, in this job, to document things. The firm name was Carling Aldsworth, Barristers and Solicitors. I didn't show how hard that landed. I thanked him and went back to raking leaves. That evening, I called the only person I still trusted who was connected to the legal world, a woman I'd known through Lorne, a retired Crown attorney named June who lived in Guelph and who had always quietly believed there was something wrong with my case. I hadn't contacted her since before my sentencing. I was afraid of what her silence might mean. She answered on the third ring. When I told her what I'd found, there was a long pause. Then she said, "Evelyn, I need you to come here tomorrow and bring everything you've printed." June's dining room table disappeared under paper by noon. She was calm and methodical and furious in the way that certain women are, quietly, efficiently, like a furnace. She knew the past case. She'd heard about the settlement at the time. She said there had been informal talk in legal circles that Ashworth had been sitting on original documents that contradicted Wired's version of events, specifically a letter signed by Pasquet himself, written 4 months before his death, explicitly revoking any prior agreement with Wired. If that letter existed and was buried with Lorne, June said, it means Wired knew it was there, and it means someone told him. Who would have known? Someone with access to Lorne's final affairs, his estate, his burial arrangements. She looked at me. Who arranged the funeral, Evelyn? My daughter had. My daughter and her husband. I had not spoken to my daughter in 5 years. She had stopped writing after the 2nd year. The letters had grown shorter and more formal, and then simply stopped. I'd told myself she needed distance. I told myself she was protecting herself. I had not allowed myself to think the other thing. Her name is Wendy. She was 31 when I was convicted. She is 39 now. I called her from June's kitchen, standing at the window looking at a birch tree that had lost most of its leaves. She picked up after 6 rings. Her voice was careful, distant in the way of someone who has practiced. "Mum?" Not a greeting, more like a statement. "I need to ask you something, Wendy. About your father's funeral. About the arrangements." Silence. "Did someone help you with the arrangements? Someone connected to your father's work?" A longer silence. Then, "Why are you asking this?" "Because someone opened your father's grave last year and took something from it. And I need to know who knew it was there." I heard her breath change. "Wendy, I need you to tell me." There was a man. Her voice had gone very quiet. "He came to see me about 2 months before Dad died. Said he was a colleague, a lawyer Dad had worked with. He was very kind. He helped me understand the financial side of things, what to expect, how to manage." She stopped. "His name was Dennis. He said Dad had mentioned I might need someone to help navigate things if the worst happened." My hand tightened on the phone. "After Dad died," she continued, "he helped me with the estate paperwork. He was always very careful. He asked once if Dad had left any original client files at home, or if there had been anything placed in—" She stopped again. "He asked if anything had been placed in the casket." "And what did you tell him?" A long pause. I told him that Dad had asked to be buried with a small sealed box. He said it was personal papers. I didn't ask more. Did you tell this man Dennis about the box? The silence was its own answer. Wendy. I kept my voice steady, with every bit of effort I had. I don't blame you. You didn't know. But I need you to tell me everything you remember about him. She did. She talked for 40 minutes. And by the end of it, I had enough. Dennis, Wired had spent 2 years cultivating my daughter's trust while I was in prison. He presented himself as a family friend, a mentor, someone filling a void. He learned about the box. He'd waited, probably while legal proceedings kept him from acting. And then he'd arranged to have the grave opened through Carling's firm under a forged estate authorization. What he'd taken was the Paskey letter, the one document that, if it had been produced during the estate litigation, would have ended his case and potentially exposed his fraud. What he hadn't counted on was that Lorne was a careful man. Frances, the secretary, remembered something else when I called her back. Lorne had mentioned, very briefly, that he'd made a digital copy of the Paskey envelope. He'd emailed a scan to himself at a private address, not his work email, with instructions to a trusted colleague to access it if Lorne ever died unexpectedly. That colleague was a retired judge in Hamilton named Arthur Simone, who had been Lorne's articling principal in 1981. I drove to Hamilton with June. Arthur Simone was 81, sharp as a tack, and deeply unhappy about what he'd been carrying for 8 years. He'd received Lorne's email. He'd seen the news of Lorne's death and then my conviction, and he had assumed, wrongly, he said, with genuine pain, that the situation was more complicated than it appeared. He had not come forward. He had told himself it wasn't his place. He opened the email on his laptop at the kitchen table and printed it for us. It was 12 pages. The core document was exactly what June had described. A letter in Gerald Paskey's handwriting dated 4 months before his death, explicitly revoking any prior verbal understanding with Dennis Wired regarding the 3 properties, witnessed by 2 people whose names I didn't recognize, notarized. At the bottom, in Lorne's handwriting, a note, kept original at home for safekeeping. If retrieved by my estate, please ensure it reaches the Law Society and the Court of Record. If anything has happened to me under unusual circumstances, please consider who benefits from this document's disappearance. June read it once, set it down, and said, "We're going to the RCMP. It took 3 months. I won't pretend it was simple or quick. There were interviews and affidavits and moments when I thought the whole thing would collapse under the weight of bureaucracy. But June had contacts, and Arthur Simone had credibility, and the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit had already been looking at Dennis Wired on separate matters. Wired was arrested in February at his condominium in Toronto. He was charged with fraud over $5,000, obstruction of justice, and interference with human remains. Howard Carling's firm was referred to the Law Society for disciplinary proceedings. 3 of Carling's associates had known about the forged authorization letter. My conviction was reviewed by the Ontario Court of Appeal. The court found that the original investigation had failed to adequately pursue an alternative suspect, namely Wired, who had a documented motive, who had visited our home the evening of Lorne's death, according to a neighbor who was never interviewed, and whose car had been seen on our street. The conviction was quashed in April. I was 64 years old when the court told me what I had known since the night I woke up to sirens. The compensation from the province of Ontario was $7.5 million, 9 years of wrongful imprisonment, plus pain and suffering. I sat in June's car in the court parking lot and we didn't say anything for a while. There was nothing adequate to say. $7.5 million doesn't give you back the feeling of waking up in your own bed. It doesn't give you back the phone calls you didn't make, or the Christmases that didn't happen, or the years your daughter spent half motherless, being managed by a man who was using her. But it gives you something to work with. I bought a small house in Guelph, not far from June. I bought Theo Russell's boy, the one in the rubber boots, a proper winter coat, and a junior chess set. because he mentioned once that he wanted to learn. I set up an education fund for him. Russell wept a little and looked away, and then said gruffly that it was too much, and I told him it wasn't close to enough. Wendy and I are rebuilding. It is slow and not always easy. She carries guilt she doesn't deserve, and I carry grief I haven't finished with. And sometimes those things collide in the middle of a phone call, and we have to stop and breathe. But she comes for dinner now. Last month she helped me plant tulip bulbs in the backyard, and we worked side by side in the cold and talked about her father, the real version, the one she deserved to know. Careful and kind, and quietly brave. She cried. I did too. I've started volunteering with a legal aid organization in Waterloo Region that works with people in prison who believe they've been wrongfully convicted. There are more than you'd think. I sit across from them at a table, and I look them in the eyes. And I tell them that the process is slow and uncertain, and sometimes the truth stays buried for a long time. But it does come up. It always comes up eventually. Lorne knew that. He trusted it enough to put the proof in the ground and wait. On the first anniversary of my release, I went back to Sunridge Memorial. Not to Lorne's grave, though I went there too, and stood for a long time and said things I won't repeat here. I went first to find Theo, who was doing his homework at the kitchen table in the groundskeeper's cottage while his father finished locking up. He looked up when I came in and said, without preamble, "I've been practicing the rook." "Show me," I said. We played 2 games at the kitchen table while Russell made tea. Theo beat me on the second game and was very dignified about it, which made me laugh for the first time in longer than I could account for. Outside, the maples were bare and the sky was the particular gray-blue of an Ontario dusk in late October. Walking back to my car, I stopped at Lorne's grave for one last moment. The chrysanthemums I brought were already going brown at the edges from the cold. But they were there. And so was I, finally, after all of it, still standing. Still asking questions, still finding that the truth, when it finally surfaces, has the weight and relief of something that was always meant to be found. I think about the night Lorne put those documents in a sealed box and asked to be buried with them, and I don't know whether to call it wise or heartbreaking. Probably both. He knew something was wrong. He knew the truth was in danger of disappearing, and so he did the one thing he could. He kept it somewhere no one would easily think to look, and he trusted that eventually someone would. What I've had to sit with all these months since the conviction was quashed is the question of what actually saved me. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It wasn't one person swooping in. It was a chain of small, quiet decisions made by ordinary people who chose to do the right thing even when it cost them something. Frances, who kept her unease to herself for 8 years but never threw away what she knew. Arthur, who held on to an email he didn't fully understand and felt guilty about it for nearly a decade. Russell, who photographed a letter because something felt off, even though the easier choice was to look away. And Theo, 7 years old, wearing rubber boots, offering a secret to a stranger because it seemed like the right thing to do. Children haven't yet learned the adult habit of deciding that something isn't their problem. Every one of those choices mattered. Every one of them was a thread, and together they pulled the truth back to the surface. I used to think that what had destroyed my life was one man's greed. Dennis Wired's willingness to watch an innocent woman go to prison so he could protect a fraudulent claim. That's real, and it's ugly, and he'll answer for it in court. But the longer I sit with everything that happened, the more I see that what nearly kept me buried was something quieter and more common. The human tendency to decide that the complicated thing is someone else's responsibility. Arthur waited. Wendy trusted the wrong person because she needed someone to trust. I myself, in the years before Lorne died, sensed something was wrong in our life and didn't press hard enough to find out what. That's not guilt. I've spent enough time carrying guilt I didn't earn. It's more like clarity, the understanding that paying attention is not a passive thing, that asking the uncomfortable question, even when you're tired, even when it feels like it might open something you'd rather keep closed, is one of the most important things a person can do. What I know now is that integrity isn't just about the big moments. It's Russell photographing a forged letter on a quiet evening because something nagged at him. It's Francis keeping a detail tucked away on the chance it would matter someday. It's my daughter finally speaking the truth out loud, even though it meant admitting she'd been used. Honest choices, made without certainty that they'd lead anywhere, made simply because they were honest. And the resolve, the sheer, stubborn refusal to accept that the wrong answer was the final answer. That was the only thing I had in those years that no one could take from me. Not comfort, not family, not freedom, but the knowledge that I knew what had happened and that I would not stop looking until the rest of the world knew it too. I meet people now, through the legal aid work, who are still inside that darkness. And I tell them what I've come to believe. The truth has weight. It doesn't evaporate, and the people who buried it will spend an enormous amount of energy keeping it down, which means it is always working its way back up. Your job is simply to still be standing when it surfaces. Lorne knew that. He put it in writing and trusted the ground to keep it safe. He was right.